Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight. A very warm welcome to you all. My name's Anna Meredith. I'm the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Natural Sciences. I have that great privilege. And it's also a great privilege to introduce this inaugural lecture tonight. Inaugural lectures are really special events. I think they're fantastic events. It gives us a chance to celebrate an individual's career to date, all their achievements and success, and the amazing talent that we're so lucky and proud to have here at Keele. So I'm very pleased to introduce Jim to you tonight. Jim, I know, is familiar to many of you. And I'm also very pleased to extend a very warm welcome to Jim's family, his wife Michelle and his parents Carol and Steve, who are here to support Jim. So for background, Jim completed his BSc, MSc and PhD in the Centre for Cognitive Neuroscience at Bangor University. Jim joined Keele in 2010 as a lecturer in psychology and was promoted to senior lecturer in 2016, to reader in 2021, and is now Professor of Cognitive Science. He was promoted to that role in 2024 this year, and hence this opportunity for his inaugural lecture. So Jim is internationally recognised as a cognitive scientist. He's focused on attention and memory. And the mission of Jim's work is to conduct rigorous fundamental research to understand these aspects of human cognition and then use this knowledge to tackle clinical and applied questions. A large part of Jim's work has also focused on reform of scientific practice in psychology around open and reproducible research. Jim has also held significant leadership roles within the university. He was head of school for psychology between 2017 and 2020, and he currently serves as the school's director of research and is also the university academic lead for research integrity and improvement. So I think this is probably the most imaginative title I've ever seen for an inaugural lecture. You still can't play 20 questions with nature and wind, so without further ado, over to you, Jim.
Great,
thank you.
Yeah, so I have received a few queries about the title, so I do hope it will become clear to you as I progress through the talk. So I've been to a few inaugural lectures at Keele, and each one seems to be quite different in how they approach it. So I was trying to explain to a friend who's a non-academic what the purpose of an inaugural lecture is. And I said, well, it's a combination really of this is your life in short form and then something about your research. I realize I'm probably dating myself by putting this image up here. So I'm going to get some of the this is your life part out of the way, just give you an idea of my academic journey, because I think it was quite non-traditional. So I was at secondary school in the southeast of England, and I wasn't particularly academic at school. I did okay, but it wasn't really for me. So I decided after my GCSEs to drop out of school and not pursue A-levels. I pursued a music career, working in Andy's Records, a record shop in Cambridge. And again, I'm dating myself. I could only find this image online, and it's incredibly pixelated. Just showing how long ago it was. But after 12 to 18 months working at Andy's Records, I thought maybe I'd better go back to college and do something. So I went to sixth form in Cambridge, and I studied English language, music technology, which I failed. I got a U in music technology. And I did this new subject called psychology, which came in handy a while later. But university wasn't for me, so I decided after my A-levels to not pursue university and re-pursue my music career, this time at Virgin Records. But I also started a band, and I put this up here to prove I did have hair at one point. So, but after a short while, I was headhunted to British Home Stores, where I was a store detective, and I was promoted to loss prevention manager. And all jokes aside, I think this is where I got my love for data and analysing numbers, because much of this work, there was part of it chasing shoplifters out of the store, but a lot of it was looking at credit card fraud, not just for customers, but also for staff as well. And as I was leaving BHS, we were in the process of prosecuting our assistant manager for processing fraudulent refunds onto their own credit card. But after a little while working in this, I thought I had better go to university. But I went to university. I was around 22 when I went to university eventually, and I went to Bangor University because my brother had been to Bangor and I'd visited him a few times, and it looked like a good place to spend 3 years. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I thought it was a good way to spend 3 years productively whilst I decide what I want to do with my life. But a series of quite serendipitous events occurred whilst I was at university, but it wasn't until the end of my second year. We were allocated our final year project supervisor at Bangor towards the end of our second year, and I was assigned to George Horton, who is quite possibly the most intelligent man I've ever met. So a really, really bright guy, bright researcher. So I thoroughly enjoyed working with George. But it was working with his PhD student. So I met his PhD student, Rhys, and it was Rhys who really instilled a passion for research. He was, his love for research was really, or still is, infectious. And we used to spend a lot of time talking about research, but I was only entering my final year project, so a lot of it was above my head. But I enjoyed the process of talking about research with him. But it was around this time, end of second year, entering my third year, that I decided that I wanted to be a researcher. And I hadn't been performing too well at university, so I really knuckled down in my third year, and I spent quite literally 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. And Michelle, my wife, will remember dropping me off in the morning, picking me up after work, spend it in Bangor Library revising, and it looks luxurious, and it is a really fantastic library, but I spent all of my time in the dungeons, because this is where the psychology journals were. So I would spend my day working on course material, but also reading journals and the new journals, and in particular the Journal of Experimental Psychology, my absolutely favorite journal, and it was here that I spent my days. But the serendipitous events continued because I used to spend a lot of time with Rhys talking about research, talking about experimental ideas, and it was one particular Sunday we had been out for lunch, had a few drinks, and we were having again a chat about research, and it was in the Greek Taverna in Bangor, where we discussed an experimental idea that went into some of Rhys's PhD work, which we eventually published the year after in the Journal of Experimental Psychology. But it was also that Sunday that I met my wife as well. So Michelle went to Bangor University for her studies, and it was there that we met on that day. So a paper and a wife all in one day. So that was great. So as Anna said, I did my MSc and my PhD with George Horton at the Centre for Cognitive Neuroscience in Bangor University. And this was the building, this was the PhD students building, the Lloyd building. And it was an incredibly intellectually stimulating period of my life. Being around research, conducting my own research, but also talking to other PhD students about the research that they're doing. It was a really great time. Entering my third year of my PhD, my supervisor knocked on my door and said that he'd seen a job advert for a psychology lectureship at Keele University. And I said, "Why are you telling me? I'm not ready for this." But he said, "Well, put an application in anyway, and just go through the process of applying. If you get an interview, that's great. It will be good practice." But I actually got the job. I'm not quite sure how, but don't take it away now. So it was then that I met Michael Murray, who was the head of school at that time. And really, I have a lot to, I owe Michael quite a lot, because not only did he give me that shot, that first chance at an academic career, he was incredibly supportive during the early period of my career as well. So massive thanks to Michael. And here I am today. So I'll tell you a little bit about some of the work that I was doing during my PhD and the first few years whilst I was at Keele. And to be fair, I still do some work around this today. And it focuses on a notion in cognitive science called cognitive control. So how does the cognitive system control its own system? And how does it produce goal-directed behavior? And in particular, I'm interested in attention and memory and how they interact to produce goal-directed behavior in multitask situations. And this is really important because humans, we live in a very rich multitask environment where we're continuously surrounded by a number of objects. So if you think of a typical office environment, there are a number of objects that you could interact with at one point in time. So in order to operate in a goal-directed manner, we need to be able to select the most relevant object to act upon. But object selection is only half the battle that the cognitive system faces, and that's because objects are often multivalent, and this is just a fancy term for there are lots of things you can do with certain objects. So if you think of a laptop, there are many different operations or tasks you can perform on a laptop. You can check your email, you can check the weather, you can play an online game of chess. So it's important that you're able to select from all of the possibilities the relevant task to your current goals. So to be able to filter through all of the possibilities and focus on the task that you need to perform in the moment. Once you've selected a task, you need to be able to maintain that task in a stable mental representation, or just to bring it to really strongly into the focus of your attention so that you don't get distracted by all of the other things that you could be performing with that object. So you need to be able to maintain a representation of the task you're performing to prevent task-irrelevant intrusions. But at the same time, when your goals change, you need to be able to switch and engage in a different task at a moment's notice. And this is really the hub of a lot of my research interests in the early stages of my career. And it centers around this notion called the stability-flexibility dilemma. So on the one hand, mental task representations, the thing you're holding in the focus of your attention, need to be incredibly stable so that you don't get distracted and you're able to perform what you're focusing on. So you need incredible stability, but at the same time, these representations must be incredibly flexible so that you can switch to a new task when your goals change. It's no good being so engaged with checking your emails that if the fire alarm goes off, you're unable to disengage from that and engage in a new behavior. So how is it that a mental representation can be incredibly stable, so completely immovable, but at the same time you're able to get rid of it at a moment's notice? And that is really the center of the research questions that I was asking around this. Most people know me as a task-switching researcher, and I think some people think this is all that I do, and to be fair, it's a lot of what I do. So I want to give you a little bit of a flavor for, and hopefully I'll be able to replicate a key effect in the task-switching literature with you today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present a series of numbers to you, and they're going to be in red and blue. But all I want you to do is just work from left or right, and just in your own head, just judge whether the number is lower or higher than 5. So in your head, just be lower, higher, lower, etc. Okay, pretty straightforward? Okay. Okay, pretty straightforward. Okay, so you're just performing one task throughout all of those numbers, but now what I'm going to get you to do is to switch between two tasks. So I'm going to present you a fresh set of digits in a second, but I'll just keep these on the screen just to explain. So for the first digit, I want you to judge whether it's lower or higher than 5, but the next digit I want you to judge whether it's red or blue, and then switch back to lower, higher than 5, red, blue, lower, higher, red, blue, and keep alternating until you reach the end of the list. Okay? Go. I can see the people in the audience who've seen this talk before, or parts of it. I'm hoping you've had the experience that this was perhaps more challenging than the previous. So when you're switching between multiple tasks, it is more costly to your performance. You're slower. You're probably going to be making more errors than just doing the same thing throughout the whole list. So this is task switching in a nutshell, but we don't do this in the lab. So in the lab, we present a computerized experiment. Again, we'll present digits to participants, but they'll just be presented on a computer screen, one digit at a time. and then there'll be a word cue that tells them which of two tasks they need to perform on that digit. Judge whether it's odd or even, or judge whether it's lower or higher than 5. And what we do is we randomize the task so that on some trials you'll be repeating the task you performed on the previous trial, and on other trials you'll be switching. And what we're doing is we're recording response times and accuracies via millisecond precise keyboards. And what we find is that, just as we've hopefully replicated here today, task switching produces significantly slower response times than task repetition trials. And this difference in performance is known as the switch cost, and we use that switch cost as a measure of people's ability to flexibly switch between mental operations. We think this tells us something interesting about what the cognitive system is doing whilst it's multitasking. We can use it for individual differences. We can use this switch cost to understand clinical profiles. So it's not an exaggeration to say there have been hundreds of papers written about this particular effect. Getting on to the title of my talk, though, so the task switching paradigm consumed me for an early stage of my career. And I think I was 2, maybe 3 years into my lectureship at Keele when I read this paper, which was honestly the most influential paper that I've ever read. This had a significant impact on how I approach my research. It was by Alan Newell. He was a computer science scientist, cognitive scientist at Carnegie Mellon. He was researching artificial intelligence before it was cool. And he published a paper called "You Can't Play 20 Questions with Nature and Win." And my title of my talk is a nod to this paper. And in this paper, he observed that experimental psychology generally deals with phenomena. So here are several phenomena that I've published on over the years. I've just described one of these phenomena to you, the task switch cost. Let me briefly describe another one because it will become relevant a little while later, called the flanker interference effect. So this is a classic effect in experimental psychology. Again, it's a computerized response time and accuracy task, but instead of presenting digits, what we do is we present a series of arrows to participants, and your job as the participant, is this laser working? Yes, is to just focus on the very central arrow, ignore the two flankers either side of it, and just judge whether it points to the left or to the right. So in this case, correct would be a left response, correct in the second trial would be a right response, and in this third trial, because you're supposed to be ignoring these flankers, correct would be a left response. So this is a classic test of visual attention, visual selective attention, because you need to be able to selectively attend to the central target and filter out the two flankers, otherwise you'll be making an error. So when the information that you need to ignore is compatible with the response you need to make, this is known as a congruent trial. And when the information is incompatible, this is known as an incongruent trial. And just like the switch cost, we find significantly slower response times to these incongruent trials compared to congruent trials. And this is known as the flanker effect, and people have been publishing on this for over 50 years to try and understand what is causing it, what increases it, what decreases it. It's a really neat effect. But this is one of these phenomena that Alan Newell was talking about. And his problem with these is that there's just too many of them in experimental psychology. Experimental psychologists are just obsessed with these effects. We discover these effects in our work, and then what we do is we conduct a series of experiments and publish a flurry of papers on these effects, just pushing them around, testing boundary conditions of these effects, and getting lots of lines on our CV in the process. But he said, well, fundamentally what you're doing is you're just playing 20 questions with nature. You're just formulating simplistic questions on these small effects, and you're just tweaking small effects, and this is not really going to lead to any progress in understanding cognition at all. So he emphasized this with a really clever thought experiment, and this is what had the biggest impact on me. Imagine a timeline between the day you obtained your PhD, for those in the room who have gone through this for For others at different stages of your journey, you'll be able to find a different analogy. But between your PhD and today, you've published a number of papers. I wish it was this large, but this was what ChatGPT gave to me when I asked for an image of papers. So you published a number of papers on these effects, that you've been tweaking these effects, you've been conducting lots of experiments on the flanker effect, on the switch cost, etc., and you've done a number of publications on them. But he said then, imagine from today until the day you retire, you will publish another batch of papers. Again, hopefully it'll be this number, but there'll be a number of papers that you'll publish from today until the day you retire. And his thought experiment was, if I was to give you all of those future papers, all of the papers you're going to publish from today until the day you retire, if I gave them all to you today, will you now have a complete understanding of human cognition? And his argument was, probably not. You'll want another batch of time, another batch of papers before you're really making any progress. If by any means you think you will have a complete understanding of cognition at that point, how is it that you've come to that understanding via this 20 questions approach? Just these really small effects, small experiments. How are you making this significant process that you now fully understand cognition? Cognitive science, cognitive psychology really works by a divide and conquer approach. So understanding the whole of human cognition is impossibly complicated. So this is represented by all of these series of cogs interacting. Each cog represents a different aspect of human cognition. Understanding the whole piece is really too complicated. So what we do as cognitive researchers is we divide and conquer. We only focus on one particular aspect. So we just focus on one cog. This could be memory, could be attention, it doesn't really matter. But we may spend years, maybe our whole career, on this particular aspect of cognition. We develop clever experiments, we develop clever theories about how this particular part of the machinery works. And the hope is that other researchers are doing likewise, but on different parts of the machine, so different parts of human cognition. And at some point in the future, we can all come together and put these pieces together, and that will give us this complete understanding of human cognition. Alan Newell said that this will not happen. This divide and conquer approach just doesn't work. And he suggested 3 solutions to overcome this problem. And as much as possible, I've tried to integrate elements of these in the work that I've done since reading this paper. Some, but not all. The first one is to develop computational models. Your theories should be expressed either mathematically or computationally, so they can be tested against human data, and they can also be tested against each other. So we can test our theories against each other if they are expressed computationally. Second, we should integrate findings across attention, memory, perception, etc. We should integrate those findings via so-called unified theories of cognition. And his final solution was, if you don't want to do either of those two, pick a complex task, but study all of it. So don't just study perception, don't just study human memory. Select a really complicated real-world task and study all of it. So let me just go through each of these. The first one, develop computational models. So I have quite a passion for cognitive modeling. It's something that I've been doing for about 8 years or so. And cognitive modeling, I think, is essential for how we think about our theories in cognition. And as I said, understanding cognition is challenging because the human mind is impossibly complex. So what we do with cognitive models is we abstract away from unnecessary details, and in the models we emphasize only the factors that we think underlie the phenomena under investigation. Much like a model of the solar system, the real physics obviously doesn't operate like it is in this animation here, but this is a simplified model that we can use to try and get a handle on the more complex thing that we're interested in. And we can do the same with cognitive modeling. Many cognitive researchers may use just flow diagrams of their models. They may explain the difference between working memory and long-term memory, by recourse to visual analogies or these so-called box and arrow diagrams. But Alan Newell was convinced that, no, it needs to be expressed mathematically or computationally, and that gives it the rigor of being able to communicate your theory to other researchers and to be able to test those models against data. And this is important for cognition because we're dealing with a black box. We can't really, aside from certain aspects of neuroimaging, but we can't really peek inside the head and see what's going on. Okay, so the mind is a black box. What we do have as experimental researchers is really tight control over the stimuli that we present to our participants, because we've got high-powered computers and the timing is obviously superb. So we can control what we provide to the black box, and we can measure with great precision what comes out of the black box via response times, accuracy measures, etc. So cognitive modeling allows us to theorize about what's going on in the black box and express this mathematically or computationally, and then test that against the data that we're obtaining from our participants to try and get some handle on whether our theory actually is going to be of use in explaining the phenomena under investigation. His second solution was to integrate findings via unified theories of cognition. So I mentioned that researchers tend to focus just on one cog. So it's great if you're developing theories computationally about this particular cog. But he said, well, no, go one step. There should be researchers, and it won't be everybody, should work on producing a computational model of the whole system at once. So how does perception interact with attention? How does attention interact with memory? How does memory interact with decision making? People should be modeling the whole thing. And he did make some progress with this via so-called unified theories of cognition, such as ACT-R. But it's obviously a very, very complex and quite daunting endeavor. So his final solution was to analyze a complex task, but do it completely. So move away from the simplified experiments that we're such a fan of in cognitive science, of just presenting digits to participants and simplistic cues. No, do away with this. Pick a real-world task that is complex and study all of it. So one analogy I use when I'm trying to explain how my work may have some impact in the real world, so to speak, I always like to use the analogy of an air traffic controller. So if you think of an air traffic controller, they've got to use selective attention to look at the screen and to pick which object they want to interact with. They need to use memory retrieval about what they need to inform the pilot. But if you're taking Alan Newell's approach here, you should go beyond that as well. Air traffic controllers receive information via their ears, via their eyes, and they communicate with keyboards, but also with their mouth as well. So you should develop an understanding about how all of that is working. So don't just be a perception researcher, don't just be an attention researcher, be an air traffic control operator researcher and understand all of those aspects of cognition. That will force you to think beyond just the individual cog that you thought you were of interest. It will allow you to study more cogs and how they interact. So I haven't been able to do all of those different aspects, but it did shape my thinking and in terms of how I frame my research and how I think about my research. And again, a nod to Michael Murray, I felt that my research was a little bit all over the place. I'm a bit of a research magpie. I get interested in lots of different things. And I felt that I was a little bit all over the place. And he said, well, just sit down and just think how you can fit all of the work into three broad areas. And a lot of the work that I do is about research reform, how we actually conduct research. So I'm interested in the rigor around research. I'm always interested in fundamental research. So at heart, I'm a basic researcher rather than an applied researcher. But if our theories of cognition are to be of any use, we should be able to apply them to some real-world phenomena. This could be applied questions, or it could be clinical questions. So the rigorous parts, for those who have listened to any talk that I've given over the past 2 years, I promise this will be the only time that I mention open research at this point, but it's about doing open and reproducible research, high experimental power, I use Bayesian analysis, but you should be using as strong statistics as possible, and of course, computational modeling. Fundamental research in human cognition. My primary interests are attention, memory, categorization, and decision-making. And more recently, I have been branching out into clinical and applied questions. So I'll talk a little bit about the work that I've done with depression, autism, and mild cognitive impairment as well. So just to give you an example about how I've tried to bring all of this together to answer basic questions, but then also some applied questions. And I'll just talk for a little bit about basic decision-making, because this is fundamental to all aspects of human cognition. And that's because many cognitive operations end with a simple decision-making process. It doesn't matter what you're retrieving from memory. It doesn't matter what you're attending to. At some point, you're going to have to make a decision and make a response in the experiment that we have you in. So the example I've given to you already, I might present you with a digit, and you need to judge whether it's odd or even. So you will go through some churning away in your mind, and you'll come to a decision, okay, the digit is even, and then you'll produce a response that's even. With the flanker example, you see a string of arrows. You focus right on the central arrow, and again, you go through some mental processing, and you come to a decision of left. Or I went out for lunch with my parents and Michelle. You may be offered some dessert, and you think, no. So come to a decision, I'm not going to have any chocolate cake. So these are examples of binary decisions. So you've got an either-or choice. You've got one of two choices that you can make in these contexts. And we can model these using the so-called diffusion model family. And this is a computational model of two-choice response time tasks that can be extrapolated to quite complex behavior in the real world. So this is probably the most involved slide that I will have. So I'll just spend just a minute talking you through what this model shows. So we're imagining an experiment where we're presenting a participant with the digit 7, and the participant needs to decide whether the digit is odd or even. So the diffusion model models this decision behavior as the steady accumulation of evidence towards one of two response boundaries. So you'll see this evidence will begin to accumulate in a noisy fashion over time. Time is on the x-axis, until after some period, it will then reach one of those response boundaries, and that is the model making a decision that the digit is odd. To provide, this is just a simulation of just 10 responses. There is noise in the model, so it doesn't produce deterministic behavior. So the model will actually allow us to reproduce what we find in participants. Participants, if you present them with exactly the same information, they won't respond identically every single time. You get a response time distribution from your participants. And not only that, even with a very simple task, participants make a small number of errors. And this model is able to capture that because, as you see on some of the trials, the noise in the system is so great that it actually just drives the accumulation process to the boundary that represents the incorrect response. So this is really for the psychologists in the room. But we have a way, computationally, to model in our participants how they're making this decision. We can model their response time distributions and their accuracy rates. So when we fit this model to the data, this is just a visual schematic, there's mathematics behind it, we get important pieces of information back from the model. One is an estimate of the participants' drift rate. And what this is just over hundreds of trials, what is the average rate of evidence accumulation for that participant? And this is a measure of how efficiently people are able to process information. So people with a higher drift rate are able to process information more rapidly. They can come to a decision more rapidly, and this diffusion process hits the boundary more quickly. A second important piece of information we get is the threshold, the response threshold. How much evidence is required before the model commits itself to a response? If you can think, if you're in an experiment just judging whether a digit is odd or even, well, you'd be very quick. You're probably not too cautious with your responding. But if I say, well, if you make an error, you'll get an electric shock. Don't worry, we don't do that. you're probably going to be more cautious with your responding. Your system's going to demand more evidence before it commits itself to a response. So in the model, this threshold value would be higher. So there's some research where we've applied this model to real-world questions. So I did a piece of work with Richard Stevens. That's not Richard on that slide. There's Richard. Looking at the effect of alcohol hangover on this rapid decision-making process. We know that alcohol itself significantly impairs decision-making. But what was not known is, well, when there's no alcohol in the system, but you're suffering from the hangover, and this was an area that Richard was very much interested in at the time, is performance similarly disrupted? So we had participants in an experiment, poor participants, they were hungover, and then I presented hundreds of trials to them where they just have to judge whether a digit is odd or even. So probably not the best way to spend a period of hangover. And then we invited them back into the lab where we knew that they weren't hungover. And we applied this model to the data, and we found two things. First of all, under conditions of alcohol hangover, the drift rate was significantly lower than in the control condition. So this suggests that alcohol hangover significantly impairs information processing speed, your ability to accumulate evidence towards a response boundary. Not only that, we found that the response threshold was higher, and this suggests that participants probably realized that they were not performing too well, and they became more cautious with their responding. So this seems like a toy example, but if you think entering the Christmas period, there's drink driving campaigns, but there's no campaign about driving whilst under hungover conditions, even if there's no alcohol in your system. This research would suggest, well, your information processing speed is impaired, and you're going to be overly cautious with your responding. We can use this model also for slightly more complex aspects of cognition, and we can use a version of it to examine selective attention phenomena. So this is coming back to the flanker effect that I talked to you about earlier. Again, participants need to focus on the central arrow, ignore the flankers either side, and just judge whether it points to the left or to the right. And people are slower when the information presented either side of the target is incompatible with their response. This suggests that even though you've told them to ignore those flankers, it's impacting their ability to come to a decision. The classic theory to explain this flanker effect utilizes the so-called spotlight metaphor of attention. So early in the 50s and 60s, the spotlight metaphor of attention was that attention operates like a spotlight in a dark room, illuminating the aspects that you want to focus your attention on. Well, we can utilize this spotlight metaphor to explain this flanker effect, because if your spotlight of attention is over the whole stimulus display, that means all of that information is influencing your decision-making. And on incongruent trials, the spotlight includes irrelevant information, so it's going to disrupt and impair your decision-making ability. But the cognitive system is smart, so over time, you're able to contract that attentional spotlight and to be able to focus exclusively on that central target and make a response. But this shrinking of the spotlight takes time, and until you've shrunk that spotlight to exclusively focus on the target, you're going to be influenced by those non-targets. So we can model this, and indeed we did. So White et al. Published a model in 2014, which I generalized in 2015, where this diffusion process is influenced by whatever is contained within the attentional spotlight. So at early stages of processing, because the attentional spotlight includes all of the stimulus display, the response evidence starts to march towards the incorrect response boundary, and that's because it's being influenced by the flankers either side. But over time, you shrink this spotlight down, meaning it can correct itself, and that's how you're able to select a correct response. So we have a computational model that's able to capture this that we can then apply to participant data. And just like the standard diffusion model, it gives us several important pieces of information. One is we can have an estimate of the fidelity of perceptual representations of the participant. In order to produce a response, first of all, the participant actually needs to encode the external world. So participants need to encode the stimuli into their system before they can make a response. Well, we're able to capture the resolution with which they're encoding that information into the system. We also get an estimate of the initial width of the attentional spotlight with participants. So if a participant has quite poor attentional processes, that spotlight might be very diffuse. And we can also have a measure of how quickly people are able to contract that attentional spotlight to focus on relevant information. So this is a form of attentional control, so we can measure how quickly this attentional control operates. This allows us to ask much richer questions. So we could ask, does insert your clinical profile of interest here impact the flanker effects? Well, this would be a question that Alan Newell would say is one of those 20 questions that is probably not of any use in driving understanding forward. But applying a computational model, we can ask richer questions such as, well, does depression, for example, because that's the study I'm going to talk about, impact how diffuse the attentional spotlight is? Does depression impact attentional filtering or the ability to contract the spotlight? Or does it impact the fidelity or the quality of the perceptual representations? So we can ask these very rich questions. And this is a question that we addressed. So this was a collaboration with Michelle, my wife. So Michelle's a senior clinical psychologist. So we collaborated on this paper addressing just this. And across 3 high-powered experiments, we applied this model to the data from hundreds of participants. And we found that higher depression symptomatology was associated with poorer perceptual fidelity. So people with high levels of depression were just not encoding their external world as clearly as people with lower levels of depression. And importantly, the attentional parameters, or the ability to control attention, was not disrupted at all, or was not associated with depression symptomatology. So these models allow us to ask or address very specific questions that the standard behavioral data, the flanker effect, wouldn't allow us to address. In other work with colleagues at Sheffield, we have used these models also to understand attentional processing in adults with autism. So autism is also known to have some attentional characteristics. And we wanted to apply these models to such participants. And just with depression, we found that adults with autism also exhibited this poorer perceptual fidelity. But unlike depression, adults with autism also exhibited prolonged attentional interference. They were slower at contracting the attentional spotlight than adults without autism. So again, using these models to address these clinical questions just gives us richer information that could potentially be the target for interventions in the future. And one promising line of research along this area, I'm sorry, so this paper is in press at the moment, so I don't have the final copy edited version, but we were looking at, with collaborators in America, applying these models to people with mild cognitive impairment. And mild cognitive impairment is important to study, not just for its own sake, but the amnestic variety of mild cognitive impairment, so those with MCI who are exhibiting memory problems, are at greater risk of developing Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. Importantly, it's handy if we're able to differentiate between single domain MCI, which is where just memory is disrupted in patients, from multi-domain MCI, where memory and other aspects of cognition are also impaired. And that's because those with multi-domain MCI have a greater risk of developing Alzheimer's and other varieties of dementia. So to be able to differentiate between these two would obviously be of use. So we applied these models of the flanker effect to data from patients from each of these groups, plus a control group shown here is HC, healthy controls. And just like depression and autism, we found that those with mild cognitive impairment had lower estimates of this perceptual fidelity parameter, suggesting that those with mild cognitive impairment are not encoding the external world as efficiently as those without mild cognitive impairment. And importantly, within this parameter, we're able to differentiate between multi-domain MCI and single-domain MCI. And a model was able to use just this parameter to predict which patient group individuals belonged to, suggesting that just knowing an individual's parameter value within these models gives you some information about whether they have single-domain MCI or multi-domain MCI, which again, obviously more work is needed, but could be a potential target for future early warning methodology. Okay, so I think I'm okay for time. So just looking forward now, so I've described some of the work that I've done, and I'm conscious, giving a talk such as this today, where I am in my career, I'm very much in that mid-career stage, so my attention is now almost exclusively on this part. I guess ever since I read this paper, it's always been on this part, because it's always between today and your retirement. But it is quite more in the focus of my attention that I'm entering this stage of my career, and I really need to be thinking about these papers from now until the day I retire if I want to make an impact on the understanding of cognition. So the title of my talk is actually a message to myself. So selfishly, this is a presentation just to myself, to remind myself that you still can't play 20 questions with nature and win, and to try and move away from some of these small-scale experiments which I would have done before. And I'm doing this in three ways. The first is to have a relentless commitment to so-called slow science, and I'll explain what I mean by this. Second one is to have a greater emphasis on integrating findings across different aspects of cognitive psychology. And finally, to focus on big questions in cognitive science. So the first one, commitment to slow science. I've been speaking to as many people as I can about this and the importance of slow science, and that if we're to do research well and to produce research of high quality, we need to slow down. So I like this image up here, so we're under a lot of time pressure here, so we'll need to jump to conclusions. We don't want to be doing that with our research. We don't want to be rushing to publish our work. We want to take our time and make sure that it is robust. If relevant, we can replicate the effects before we communicate them to the wider community. I came across this term via a blog by Dorothy Bishop, a professor at Oxford, who was advocating that research funders should really emphasize and support a shift to slow science. How do we do slow science? Well, there's a great book by Cal Newport, and it was an ex-PVC for education here who got me onto Cal Newport's books about productivity, etc. So he says, if you want to be productive, you need to slow down, and you can do this in three ways. First of all, do fewer things. So related to us as researcher, work on fewer projects, publish less. Second of all, work at a natural pace. So don't rush things, just work at a natural pace and only publish when you feel it is ready and robust and ready for that communication. But at no point should you compromise on quality, and in fact, you should obsess over quality at all stages of the research process. I wasn't going to include this slide, but I think I will, because I'm conscious of who's in the audience, and maybe I shouldn't be advocating for only publishing one paper per year. But I was at a meeting of the Experimental Psychology Society a few years ago, and John Duncan, who was the president of the society, was giving his induction talk. And he mentioned that his supervisor once said to him, you should only aim to publish one paper per year. Any more than that, and you're not thinking. Any fewer than that, and you're not trying. And I felt that really impacted me, and I thought that's what we should probably be doing. As individuals, we should be working on publishing one paper of quality per year. That would still be enough for the ref. We'd still have enough, more than enough, if all of us were doing this. But it really just shifts that emphasis on slowing down and produce one thing of incredible high quality per year. Okay, I think I got away with that. Second of all, to integrate findings. So I talked about, Alan Newell suggested, just model the whole system. That's too much for me. But what I can do is I can just focus on just a few cogs at once. So I can't do the whole system, but maybe I could focus on just 2 or 3 and to understand how they integrate with each other. And to some extent, I have been doing this, but I just wasn't conscious that I was doing it. A lot of my work really just does bridge attention, memory, and decision-making. And some of these models are integrating all of those different areas of cognitive psychology into one. These are fields of research that individuals would spend their whole careers on, maybe not even considering the work going on in the other fields. They can exist entirely on their own, but to try and integrate these as much as possible. I haven't published a paper on air traffic control, but it has inspired my thinking about how to integrate attention and memory, etc. And if you think about it, an air traffic controller does need to decide what to attend to. So they need to use selective attention to decide which object to attend to. They then need to understand how to respond to that object. So what is it that I need to communicate, or what response do I need to decipher? All of this requires memory retrieval, because if you don't have memory, you won't know what to attend to. You won't know how to respond to anything. So memory retrieval underlies everything. And Larry Jacobi once said that memory is everything. To some extent, that's obviously 100% true. And ultimately, they need to execute a response. So an air traffic controller would be useless if they had great attention and great memory, but just never did anything. Okay, so they need to execute a response at some point. So like I said, I haven't done anything with air traffic control, but I've used this thinking in a recent paper. This was my one paper per year. So it was accepted just 2 days ago in Journal of Experimental Psychology. And in this paper, it's a multi-experiment paper where I extend and test a computational model that integrates all 4 of those aspects to a task switching scenario. You don't need to worry about what's on here, but there are aspects of this model where I'm utilizing other people's theories. So these circles here are elements of the theory that are about what an individual should be attending to. So this is selective attention. There are aspects in here about how the participant should respond to particular objects. There's aspects in here that borrow from theories of memory retrieval. And we also have a theory about response execution. And all of this is brought together into a single computational model that we developed and then tested over several experiments. So this is one way that you can, on a local level, still be thinking about this integration. And finally, and this will just be my final minute or so, to focus on big questions. One thing which I've been working on behind the scenes is to try and develop, and I'm at a very early stage of this in my thinking and speaking to people, to develop a large international collaboration of researchers interested in cognitive modeling, but also to bring in clinical researchers as well, to try and produce a concerted effort to apply cognitive models to a wide aspect of clinical phenomena. So working with others, I've worked with many people throughout my career, brings interdisciplinary innovation. So bring in everyone's expertise, novel approaches to clinical problems using cognitive models. This will allow targeted problem solving. By working with clinical researchers, we can understand the problems that they're facing that they need answers to, and we can develop and test cognitive models to help address those. And in any collaboration, we can share knowledge, but importantly, also resources. So this is the big question that I'll be working on over the next few years, trying to develop this collaboration and get this moving. So I'll just end with some acknowledgements. First of all, thanks to my brother on the right. That's us when we were much younger, and then that's us when we were a little bit older. Also, thanks to my parents for all of your support, but also for not getting too mad when I dropped out of school. Not once, but twice. Thanks to my wife, Michelle, for all of your support. Continued source of support and encouragement. And it wasn't until I was doing this talk, actually, I realized now my most prolific collaborator as well. So thanks for boosting my CV as well. Thanks to Keele University. It's been an absolute pleasure to have my career so far at Keele. It's really a fantastic place to work, and I've thoroughly enjoyed all of my, 14 years at Keele. To the School of Psychology, it's great to see so many of you here today, so thanks for coming along. I've got some fantastic colleagues. All of my colleagues are fantastic. Professional support, academic staff. You're all, absolute pleasure to work with, past and present. Well, I lied saying I wasn't going to talk about open research. Thanks to colleagues at the university also helping with the mission to enhance open research at Keele University as well. We've got a great committee, the Research Integrity Committee, so it's fantastic and always a pleasure to work with these colleagues, and to all of my collaborators as well. Researchers, students, it's been great working with all of you. Thank you.